So thank you very much. Welcome in Brussels, Mr. Owen. So as you indicated, it was not so easy to come into this building, into this room. So at the moment that Distripress is organizing conference, and that means also defending freedom of speech and freedom of press. At the other hand of the road here, of the street here, there is Mr. Erdogan, and he is present here. I don't think that he shall speak about freedom of speech and freedom of press in Turkey, because I think there are a few little difficulties with this. But welcome in Brussels. And welcome in the heart also of European politics, and welcome in Belgium, a country, I think, with a meaningful history in relation to the freedom of press. With its foundation in 1830, Belgium was the country with one of the most, if not the most liberal constitutions of Europe. Preventive censorship was forbidden. And contrary to almost everywhere else, you did not need a license to publish in Belgium. In fact, moreover, a lot of journalists and publishers were actively involved in the Belgian Revolution against the autocratic rule of the Dutch King William. Journalists and publishers even took seats in the very first government of the newly born state, and they managed to get some important principles anchored in the Constitution. For example, that the writer is responsible for his or her publication and not the distributor nor the publisher. And I think most people here in this room will agree that this is a key element in establishing the freedom of the press and an active press sector. So thanks to this free movement and free environment, Belgium and Brussels were free zones for intellectuals and artists during the 19th century. And the best known example being Karl Marx, who wrote his Communist Manifesto in this very city. As you might presume, I am not a fan of the ideas of the man, but that does not mean I can take pride in the fact that, in fact, he found a safe haven in Brussels, while the Prussian and French authorities wanted to persecute him. And although this is history, Belgium remains a liberal bastion in many respects today. We were the second country worldwide to establish same-sex marriage, adoption for gay couples. We have implemented progressive laws in many other domains, ranging from the full recognition of transgender people to progressive euthanasia laws. And so also the freedom of religion and the freedom of education that were cornerstones of the young Belgian nation are still that, I can tell you, Mr. Owen, today. But we can never take these liberties for granted. Human rights and civil liberties are not a given, and defending and protecting them is, I think, a continuous battle. And Belgium may have been #1 in the freedom of the press some 150 years ago. Today, according to Freedom House, this country, we are ranked number 11. So that's still not bad, still very good, but no longer the best. As a small country hosting 3 language groups, Belgium should remain vigilant of the risk of it. The freedom of the press and the freedom of speech are, as you know, not typical Belgian values. They are universal values and established by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and born here in Europe. And Belgium, as a founding member of the European Union, is a strong proponent of more European integration. We try to push the ever closer union forward. and not in order to create what some people call a European superstate, but to form a common European capacity in those fields where more and better cooperation is absolutely key, absolutely needed. I strongly believe that the European Commission can do much more, for example, to bolster our common European values, including freedom of speech and freedom of press. We have the Copenhagen criteria, as you know, that are criteria setting the standards for countries that want to join the European Union. And these criteria are very tough and very strict, as Mr. Erdogan at the other side of the street knows it very well, but they can easily be considered as the gold standard for democratic governance and human rights. And it means that eligible member states have to accept all obligations. And the problem is, however, that once you are a member of the European Union, once you've passed the Copenhagen test, the Copenhagen criteria, there is no supervision anymore. In theory, there are checks and sanctions. Moreover, Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union that stipulates you can, even at the end, if you don't follow the recommendations of the Union, you can lose your voting rights if you violate these Copenhagen criteria. But these rules are never put into practice. So it's very difficult to enter in the European Union because you have to apply this whole acquis communautaire, as we call it, including human rights, freedom of press, freedom of speech, democratic rules, human rights. But once you're in, you can do whatever you want. The best example and the most relevant for you here today is Hungary under Viktor Orban. So Mr. Orban puts members of the opposition on trial for what they have said in the parliament, you can imagine. 2 Hungarian MPs, for example, got convicted because they exercised the most important job in a democracy. They were opposing the government. The Orban administration regularly instructs also the police to raid headquarters of NGOs based on vague accusations such as undermining the Hungarian state. And the Fidesz government drastically limits the freedom of speech and of the press. Sometimes the regime is just testing the boundaries by proposing, for example, that was the last attempt, a tax on internet usage, for example. When public outrage turned out to be very, very high, the proposal was withdrawn. But more often, the government grossly violates the freedom of the press. And last year, a law was passed unfairly targeting critical media. And how they do it? Well, 2 different tax regimes were put in place. It's a very nice example. A very light tax rate for those outlets who are friendly for the regime. And then a top-heavy tax rate for media that are far more critical. And this heavy tax rate is clearly designed to undermine and ultimately bankrupt than the critical newspaper by taxing them 3-4 times more than those who are more compliant, I should say, with the regime. Well, it's not only this what is happening, also what is happening is that TV stations, such as, for example, RTL Club, have felt the consequences of these specific rules, of these authoritarian measures. And one of the leading figures of the governing political party, of Fidesz, János Lázár, didn't even try to hide the real intentions. He declared very simply and very bluntly, and I quote him, RTL, so RTL Club, threatens our country, and perhaps their practices are tolerable in Germany, but they are not tolerable in Hungary. So such a behavior is, I think, certainly not acceptable in the European Union of today. There is no such a thing as a German version of freedom of press and a Hungarian version of it. There is one clear set of values for the whole Union, and they should be enforced everywhere, and that in the same way. But I have to tell you, the RTL Club case is only one example. The last couple of years, the violations in that country are piling up. Popular radio frequencies are being sold to the most loyal broadcaster, and if you're flattering for Orban, you receive cheap credit lines from the government. And these are practices typical maybe of a banana republic, but they are taking place today here in Europe. A clear case of failing governance of the European Union. We have the rules. We have, in fact, the civil servants to enforce them. Some people are saying too much civil servants, but we are unwilling or unable to make it happen. Because the ultimate decision to suspend voting rights of a member state is taken by the Council. And the group of heads of states and government are, as you can imagine, very reluctant to punish, to correct one of its colleagues. And even if there isn't a shred of doubt that a colleague is wrong. So we have to accept that in these fundamental issues of freedom of speech, freedom of press, democratic and human rights, the European Union is the higher authority. It's not a question of sovereignty. Freedom of press is not a question of national sovereignty. Freedom of press is an international, transnational, I should say at least a pan-European value. And member states cannot negotiate a separate position or have their own version in these fundamental issues. But I have to tell you, and that was also the request that I received from Distripress, that is that the Hungarian disgrace is far from the only governance crisis that we are facing today in the European Union. I'm not going to talk about the Greek crisis. That's maybe for a next Congress or two Congresses at least. And maybe you have time to organize it, not in Dubai, but in Athens. Could be maybe in 2 years, Mr. Owen, a good place to do it. But I want to talk about the crisis of today, the refugee crisis, with another example of bad governance by this continent. A refugee problem, or the refugee problem, is not Hungary's or Greece's problem alone, because most people are entering Europe through these countries. Nor is it just a problem for Germany or for Sweden, where most refugees want to go to, and nor is it a problem only of Poland and the Baltic states, where the population is most concerned about these problems today. It's in fact a shared problem. It's a shared European problem and a shared European responsibility. And I know it is a platitude, but it is a true one. We do live in a globalized world, in a globalized economy, a world in which borders are less and less important to humanity. And for the first time, I can even say that in human history, we are seeing a wave of refugees in which people keep each other informed in real time, I should say, by Facebook, using Google Maps to choose the best route. Although the refugee crisis is dominating all our newspapers, all our media today, in fact, it's a crisis that has been coming for much longer. In recent years, more and more people have fled from jihad organizations like the Islamic State, Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, from war and violence in countries like Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, and also from a lot of failed states in Africa. And consequently, more and more people have died also, died in their attempts to cross the Mediterranean and to reach Europe. We don't know, and we don't have naturally the figures for 2015, but the United Nations have reported that a record was achieved in 2014. More than 3,400 people, men, women, children, died in the Mediterranean. So far, Europe has always resolved, or tried to resolve, this refugee crisis by transferring a little budget from the left to the right, or from the right to the left. And on behalf of the European agency Frontex, What we do, we send a few boats to sea, a few helicopters into the air, and we hope that this crisis is over for this year, waiting a new wave next year. Frontex, ladies and gentlemen, has not even a mandate to carry out rescue operations. The budget of our European Borders Agency is a pathetic 140 million a year. I compare it always to the fee that Real Madrid has paid for a footballer. One, Gareth Bale, was also something about 110 million euro. And less than 30% of that amount, so that means more or less 40 million, is allocated to joint operations. And what is more, in the most recent budget negotiations, our member states have found that it was necessary to cut into Frontex budget with to cut it with an amount of some 30 million, that is a quarter of the total budget. For those refugees who are naturally fleeing, who ultimately reach the European soil alive, the European Union has only chaos and uncertainty to offer. In the recent debate on a compulsory quota system for the allocation of asylum seekers to each of the 28 member states, the European Council was hopelessly lagging behind reality. After much bickering on an agreement was reached on the compulsory reception of 120,000 refugees, whereas in the meantime, a multiple of that number are already within our territory and on their way to Europe. Some countries, like for example Mr. Cameron of Britain, are saying, yeah, I'm going to do an enormous effort. I'm going to take 20,000 of the refugees in the next 5 years. Where in 5 days, 20,000 of these people are coming in the European Union. On top of that, the United Nations is now short of funds which are urgently needed to improve living conditions in the refugee camps in Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, and yet this is the only way in which we can ensure that people are no longer compelled to travel onto Europe, that is to improve the conditions. European countries recently pledged 1 billion euro to the United Nations, but the money was simply never transferred. And many times more than that amount is needed, as we know, to bring the camps up to an acceptable level, providing conditions in which people can live and children can be schooled there. So the chaos at our borders is now complete, with improvised camps being established in Serbia, for example, in Croatia, pure amateurism. After all, we could have foreseen this and prepared ourselves for the situation, because for years now, we thought that we could avert our eyes from the conflict in Syria, that the Middle East was not our backyard and therefore not our problem either, and we refused also to support the democratic opposition to Assad by supplying military equipment and information and by establishing a no-fly zone even after Assad used his chemical weapons 2 years ago. And in the meantime, the start of this revolution in Syria, that was the Free Syrian Army, moderate people, lawyers, maybe distributors of newspapers and magazines, in Syria. So the Free Syrian Army has been completely destroyed and replaced by the Islamic State. And this has not only compelled people to become refugees, but also fueled Islamic extremism within our borders, as we have seen with Charlie Hebdo. Doing away with Schengen and reintroducing national border controls, which is what some populists and nationalists want to see, is naturally not a solution at all. Because firstly, it is not possible to do so, I think, in our actual environment, but it's also not desirable. No country has ever become richer by putting borders between people and businesses. Abandoning the free movement of persons and goods would mean surrendering the economic prosperity that is associated with it. Or should we, like Mr. Orban maybe build walls between the different EU member states, between, for example, Hungary and Austria, and between the Netherlands then and Germany, because anyone who builds a wall must, of course, go the whole way Just like the chain, it's only as strong as its weakest link. A wall is only as strong as its weakest point. So we must tackle the refugee problem in a completely different way, jointly, internationally, at European level, with a European comprehensive approach and plan. And firstly, we must jointly protect our external borders. This is the first thing to do. The refugee crisis, yeah, there is an enormous comparison that you can make with the euro crisis. We start with a single currency, and after a few years we say, oh shit, we don't have a government. Oh, we don't have a treasury. Oh, we don't have a common authority behind, and that is the start of our problems. But the same is happening with the refugee crisis. We start with Schengen area, and then we say, oh, we don't have a common border control. We don't have a common asylum system. We don't have a common economic migration system, like the Americans should have, to give only that example, not an American Ghost Guard, for example, doing everything separately, or not having a green card system, what is a common system for the whole US. Here you have 28 different systems. So, as I said, first of all, jointly protect our external borders. If you have a common area of freedom of movement and mobility, the normal thing is that you don't, you share your protection of your borders. Today, Frontex, I already explained it a few minutes ago, is an agency depending for a considerable part for its finances on the voluntary contributions of a small group of member states. In fact, there are only 4 member states who are actually active in Frontex. Those member states, like Italy, Greece, and so on, who have a direct interest in it. But it's clear that we must expand Frontex to a full-fledged border and coast guard financed by compulsory contributions of all member states, including those one of the West and those one of the North. Rather than building a wall inside the Union, what we must do is create a European capacity for the reception of, for example, asylum seekers, to screen and register them at the border, so we can do it in a regular and organized manner. And we must also develop, I think, a similar registration capacity at the refugee camps in Turkey, in Jordan, and in Lebanon, outside Europe, because again, in order to ensure that people are not compelled to travel onto Europe to see asylum here, because that's a system. You can only ask for asylum from Europe if you are entering Europe. So what we are doing today is that we are pushing all the refugees in the arms of criminal gangs to say, yeah, you go to a criminal gang, you pay, you know what it is, what the figure is, 6,000 euro. You pay 6,000 euro to the criminal gang, and then you can enter in the European Union. And if you fail the first time, you pay again 6,000 euro for a second attempt or a third attempt. Because you can only ask for asylum inside Europe. Why not doing it in the refugee camps, in our consulates, in our embassies? There are enough people there. And secondly, we must also replace the Dublin system with an asylum policy at the European level. Today, the rules and the time limits are, in theory, the same in each European country. So in principle, there is a European system with the same criteria, and where you need to ask for asylum in the place where you enter. So mainly in Italy, mainly in Greece. But the practice is completely different. The practice is that every country applies these criteria in a different manner. And the practice is that people coming into Greece and people coming to Italy, they receive a check, they receive an amount of money, and they push them out to other countries of the European Union. And all this must change. We can only establish a permanent allocation system for refugees among the member states, and that is what we must do the urgent as possible. And thirdly, we need what we don't have in Europe, a European economic migration system to be established, which will allow people who want to work here to contribute to our economy, to contribute to our society, and not to abuse from an asylum system that is completely not fit for them. Instead of the current situation, in which the asylum procedure has to be used, has to be abused for economic reasons. What is the system in Europe? The existing European work permit that exists, that calls the blue card, because we have a blue flag, so we call it the blue card. But this blue card is only not more than a 29 system, operating in parallel with the 28 national systems. So every country has its national system, and on top of that we have then a blue card, and this blue card has to apply the conditions of every national system. So it is not a European system, it's simply a 29th system. It's only be used, in fact, by the German government on a large scale, not by any other single European country. So a single European system is needed, who is also compatible with our open internal market and on the basis of objective criteria. You can compare it with the green card in the US or the green card in Canada, and only in this way we can make a clear distinction between people who are really asylum seekers, who are refugees, who are escaping a war, and those who are abusing the system for economic migration. Well, so step-by-step solutions of the Council, of the heads of states and of government are today completely impossible. When I'm talking about Hungary not applying the basic values of the European Union, when I'm talking about the refugee crisis with the whole chaos at our borders, but I could talk, as I already indicated, about the Greek crisis or the Euro crisis, where we face the same thing. The problem is that we still try in Europe to solve these transnational problems by tackling this 28 times in a slightly different way, or with 28 decision makers around the table. I'm always comparing it, so the way we are deciding in Europe on a refugee crisis, on a Greek crisis, is 28 people around the table, and they have to agree. They have to have a consensus. They have to have unanimity. It's like every important decision in the US and the United States should be taken by the 50 governors of the US, saying, yeah, okay, are we now establishing an FBI? 50 governors have to come together. Are we tackling this or that problem? What we are doing with the dollar? What we are doing with a problem in Florida, for example, because Florida at a certain time was even worse than Greece in Europe. That every time the 50 governors of the US should come together to decide on this. Everybody should say, you're crazy, these Americans. Well, it's exactly the way we are doing it in the European Union, with 28 decision makers around the table. And this is not the way to govern any country, let alone a continent. So the world is a witness of our failure today. Last month, the New York Times published an analysis of the multiple crises facing us, and their quote was, Europe is small-mindedness in 28 national iterations. And that was Roger Cohen who said it. And in no time at all, this article was circulated around the world by Facebook and by Twitter under the heading, Europe Without Ideas. So, ladies and gentlemen, globalization is battering at our national borders, and indeed, or also at our national sovereignty. And it is true for the banking crisis, it is true for the climate change, it is true for international fraud, it is true for organized crime, it is true for ways of migration. And anyone who wants a vigorous response to all these challenges will inevitably realize that they can only be tackled at a supranational level, at a European level. And that means we must have the courage to opt for stronger European institutions. And it is not the same as to say, oh, we want more officials and we want more civil servants. It does mean more powers needed to be assigned to the supranational level, to the European level. And I'm sometimes accused of being an Europhile. The fact is that I am not romantic, I have to tell you. Politics and romanticism are not good bedfellows. I am a rationalist, and I'm a convinced European, because I believe that by means of further integration, that's the only way to defend our interests better, to reinforce our economic position, to safeguard our European values in a world that is globalized and is a world of empires tomorrow. Empires, not the 5 empires of the 19th century, you know, Prussia and Austria and Russia and Britain and France, the old Westphalian order of Europe. No, it's a world of empires, 5 again, but on the world level. America, China, India, Russia, and maybe Europe. Maybe. I'm not sure about it. So the nation state will not save us in this rapidly evolving world. That's the reality of today. Because each of the European countries on its own is simply too insignificant, both demographically but also economically. They no longer represent sufficient potential. And a good indication of that, a very good indication of that, is the composition of the G20. Yeah? Everybody is now talking more about the G20 than the G8. The G8 is the old world, the G20 is the new world. Well, it's very telling that the G20 doesn't consist of the 20 biggest economies of the world. That's not the way the G20 is working. The G20 is in fact the 20 countries worldwide with the greatest potential. That's a G20. If you would use, for example, the GDP as a yardstick, countries like Spain or the Netherlands or Switzerland should be members of the G20. Well, they are not. They are not permanent members of the group. And why? Because we have to have the courage to admit we are not heading in the right direction, and it is not the reality of today, but the potential of tomorrow, who is key in the world of tomorrow. And in the debate on the future of Europe, it's important to revert to the path, I think, of reason, of rationality. We must move away from politics that try to exploit what I call superficial, so-called cultural differences, identity on the European level. We must go back to focusing on the challenges that we all face together. And the guiding principle must be, how can we be stronger in a constantly changing world? And the changes we make must be dictated not by our prejudices or by our fears, what is happening today, but by our ambition, our sole ambition, to play a part in the world of tomorrow. And to play a part in the world of tomorrow, only Europe is capable to do so. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
If you stay for a moment, the idea here is to get questions from the floor, especially with the panel later on. So let me quickly scan the audience. If not, I'll kick it off. But any questions for the Prime Minister? Germane to our business? Right here, David. But before we get a mic, let me ask you a question. Brussels, Belgium, the home of a free press, but can an unprofitable press be free? And specifically, what should be the role of government to keep it free? Because you know what's been happening in other countries, especially in developing nations. It's becoming a plaything for billionaires. In many other countries, it's falling into the hands of industrial groups. And in other countries, subsidies come in, which could put into question the freedom and no favor of a lot of press. So is there also a role for government and for a strong European institution to play to keep it free?
Well, we are very fortunate, I should say, in Belgium and certainly in Flanders, because we have still a very active, flourishing press, printed press also in Flanders. Mr. De Nolf is here. I shall not refer to him, but other groups, and who are not for the moment also active in other countries, in the Netherlands, for example, to one of his colleagues of Mr. De Nolf, with whom he works together in the Flemish television, is a huge printing active company in Dutch press. So it's possible, apparently. So if you look to the figures, the number of newspapers that are sold in Flanders, it's huge. It's still there is a difference with the French-speaking part of the country. So the French-speaking part of the country has more difficulties than the Flemish-speaking part of the country. With the Flemish-speaking part of the country, it's good business. It's continued to be good business. And more than that, they have an expansive policy also in other countries, in the north of France, in the north of in the Netherlands.
But that's not the reality.
What we did to do that, because that's the second part of my response, is, for example, then when we started, Mr. Denolf shall remember that that part of the story, when we started by opening the monopoly of the public state, the public television in this country, we have given the possibility to the printing press to enter immediately in that business and to enter as shareholder, as a preferential shareholder in this new company. And that happened. And that is one of the, and that is the public sector who did it. It is the government who said it. The government said, yeah, we want to open the monopoly of the public television. I'm talking now about 20 years ago. And we did it by giving the possibility to the printing the companies who are active in the printing companies to enter in this audio-visual sector. And that worked very well. So I think that the future is also, there is a future for printing, certainly when it concerns companies who are diversifying themselves, not only in printing, but also in audio and in visual activities.
But to the question, does government have a role and an obligation to keep this industry profitable by any means that are suitable, conducive, subsidies, preventing?
I think so, and I think also that I'm now talking about books and not about newspapers and magazines. If you saw a few days ago that the e-books were blocking or stabilizing in a share of what it was 10%, nothing, 10% of the total printing market. So then I think there is a future for printing, because printing is something that you can keep, that you can touch, that you can feel, that you can admire. What is not the case with the letters on your iPad.
Right.
They're all the same.
Possibly, two more questions. Yeah, right there. Is this one back there, or are you just scratching your head? No. Okay. Sorry. Over to you.
Stretching is stretching is
Go.
Mr. Verhofstadt, thank you. I just wanted to ask you how Europe, and in which way, could favor the development of solid media group.
Well, there is, I think, and I'm going to respond to this more in general by criticizing now a little bit the way competition rules are applied in Europe. So I'm not going to take the example of printing companies. I'm going to take the example of trucks. That's not the same. Huh? Trucks are not newspapers, are not, but it is the same problem. And I refer here to the case of Volvo and Scania. Maybe some people in the room knew what happened. There was a merger proposal to establish the third biggest European group by merge of Scania and Volvo in the trucks. I'm now talking about
Volvo
trucks. And the Commission and the competition authority in Europe said no. Why? Because they should have a too concentrated, a too strong position, mainly in Sweden and also in Finland. And I'm saying, what are we talking about? I thought we got an internal market in Europe. And an internal market in Europe means that you have also to establish European champions on the European level. So I'm very much in favor of a more open, I should say flexible application of competition rules, so that also on the European level can emerge players who can compete with the big publishers in the US or with the big publishers tomorrow in other parts of the country. So flexible competition rules, instead of saying, oh, we are here in a market of 3 or 4 million people, they're going to have a share of 50% of the market. Is not possible. You have always to recognize that we have established now a European internal market and a competition, and fair competition has to be seen on the European market and not only on local markets anymore. Right. Otherwise, you can never create European champions.
On that note, Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, Mr. Verhofstadt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.